You ever wonder why certain people seem to know exactly how to make you question your own strength? There's a hidden truth that Carl Jung understood deeply when he said, "While you cry for justice, someone is studying your wounds to dominate you." Just let that sink in for a moment. The person who understands your pain, your vulnerability, the place you're most tender isn't always your ally. Sometimes, they're your strategist, watching patiently as your unresolved wounds quietly reveal your deepest weaknesses. But let me be clear, they don't care about your healing. They care about how your wounds can serve their agenda. Maybe you've sensed this someone who seemed too interested, too attentive, only to find out later their concern was never compassion. It was calculation. This subtle betrayal isn't accidental. It's intentional, crafted from the overlooked spaces of your emotional landscape. Because the truth, the uncomfortable truth is, that unresolved pain is never invisible. It's always broadcasting signals, messages you don't even realize you're sending. Your wounds become their territory. Your silence becomes their roadmap. And before long, your unresolved struggles become the chains they use to bind you not physically, but psychologically. Jung saw clearly that the parts of ourselves we refuse to confront don't vanish quietly. They echo, resonating loudly enough for those with sharp ears and sharper intentions. Your unconscious vulnerabilities aren't weaknesses because they're painful. They're weaknesses because they're unclaimed. And anything unclaimed can be used, reshaped, and weaponized. Niccolò Machiavelli, centuries earlier, revealed this in the cold language of power. To dominate another, first understand where they bleed. He wasn't talking about swords and shields. He spoke of emotional vulnerabilities, the silent wounds we carry and desperately hide. Your desire to be understood becomes their entry point. Your need to be heard becomes the gateway they exploit. The very empathy you crave turns into the weapon wielded against you. You're not just being manipulated, you're being strategically dismantled, piece by piece, through your unspoken pain. But imagine just for a moment, if that pain, your private torment, could become your greatest ally. What if the power dynamic reversed? Not through anger or aggression, but through clarity and awareness. What if you reclaimed your wounds before someone else could exploit them? What if instead of being read, you became unreadable, a mystery, to those who once saw you as predictable? Carl Jung didn't just warn us of emotional vulnerability. He offered a path, turning the shadow, the parts of us we avoid, into a formidable source of quiet power. Not power to dominate others, but power to never again be dominated by the unseen forces shaping your life. This is what no one teaches you, that your emotional history is a map, not just for healing, but for strategy. And until you hold that map, someone else is holding it for you using it to direct your choices, your beliefs, even your sense of worth. Every fear you ignore becomes a tool for someone else to sculpt your reality. Every memory you repress becomes the leash they tug when you start to pull away. They don't need chains, they need insight. And if you don't own that insight first, you will always belong to those who do. This isn't about self-defense, it's about self-sovereignty, about understanding precisely where you have been leaking your power, silently broadcasting signals you've never intended to share. Because when you don't own your pain, you don't just lose control, surrender the very architecture of your inner world. So yes, transform your pain into power. Make it unreadable. Make it untouchable. Make it yours again. That's how you ensure no one can ever again manipulate you through the wounds you've finally decided to confront. This video isn't here to comfort you. It's here to awaken you. Together, we'll explore precisely how emotional manipulation works, not superficially, but at its deepest, most subtle layers. And more importantly, how to dismantle it permanently. If you're getting value from this, take 1 second to like the video and follow the page. It helps this message reach more people, and honestly, that's how we keep building something real here. Now, prepare yourself. Because once you truly understand the secret ways your wounds have been used against you, you'll never be the same again. They say time heals everything. But time doesn't heal what you never confront. It only deepens the groove. And when you don't transform your pain into strategy, it quietly becomes a trap, not just for your emotions, but for your entire identity. Because every wound you ignore begins to shape the way you move, speak, and relate. You don't even notice it at first. You just become a little quieter in rooms that feel too honest. A little more agreeable when tension rises. A little more eager to explain yourself when no one asked you to. That's the beginning of it. That's how emotional pain, left unprocessed, becomes your body language. And your body never lies. It reveals what your words try to hide. You walk like someone bracing for rejection. You speak like someone who's asking for permission to exist. You laugh in the exact places where you feel the most misunderstood, not because it's funny, but because you've learned to soften your truth so others won't feel threatened. This is the cost of pain that never became clarity. You live in reaction mode. You become readable, and what can be read can be rewritten by someone else. Because here's what no one tells you. Manipulators don't need to overpower you. They just need to observe you long enough to see where your emotional patterns loop. The subtle way your voice changes when you're trying to be accepted. The way your posture closes when someone questions your value. The apologetic tone you use when you're actually telling the truth. These aren't just habits, they're scripts. And once someone recognizes your script, they don't have to fight you. They just have to trigger the next line. You've probably felt it before, that strange familiarity in toxic dynamics. As if you're being pulled into a play you didn't audition for, but somehow know by heart. That's not coincidence. That's conditioning. And the truth is painful. You've been here before, not with the same person, maybe not even in the same setting, but with the same pattern. Because pain that doesn't become insight always becomes repetition. And this is why the wound that doesn't become strategy turns into an emotional cage. Not because you can't leave, but because part of you still believes you deserve to be in it. You've adapted to your own fragmentation. You've built routines around your pain, and now, without realizing it, you protect the very behaviors that keep you small. But here's the rupture. You're not weak, you're predictable. And predictability is the foundation of all manipulation. They don't need to be smarter than you, just more observant. And when your emotional responses follow a pattern, control becomes effortless. You think they're guessing what hurts, they're not. They're replaying what you unconsciously rehearsed 100 times. So what now? Now is when you interrupt the performance. You stop reacting on cue. You replace reflex with presence. You start noticing what you always did, and ask yourself, who taught me to move like this? Who taught me that my pain should be quiet? That my intuition should be polite? That my strength should be softened? Because the person who questions that becomes unreadable. And the unreadable can't be scripted. They can't be owned. And they sure as hell can't be manipulated. Your pain has been a language for long enough. It's time it became a boundary. They told you to be kind, to be forgiving, to give the benefit of the doubt. And you did, over and over. You bit your tongue. You smiled when you wanted to confront. You stayed when everything in you screamed to walk away. And eventually, that loyalty to others became disloyalty to yourself. You started believing that wanting more strength, more clarity, more distance from chaos, made you selfish. That asserting yourself meant you were cold. That setting boundaries made you just like them. And so you stayed soft, stayed patient, stayed morally clean, while others moved freely, even carelessly, through your life. You began to associate strength with danger, strategy with betrayal, and perhaps the most dangerous belief of all. You started to think that real power would corrupt you. That's when the guilt crept in, not the guilt from hurting others. The guilt from considering your own victory. The guilt from realizing you're allowed to want things without apology. That you can have drive, vision, fire, and still be good. But that kind of stuff doesn't come easy when your entire emotional framework was built on a fragile moral code. Don't disturb the peace. Don't speak too boldly. And above all, don't win too loudly, because winning means you chose yourself. And choosing yourself, for someone raised to please, feels like abandonment, not of others, but of the role you've always played. This is the quiet war between who you've been trained to be and who you really are. Jung understood this deeply. He spoke of the persona, the identity we craft to survive socially. But the persona is not the self, it's a mask, a role. And for many of us, that role has been the good one, the reasonable one, the one who forgives too easily and explains too much. But underneath that, buried beneath years of performance, lives a sharper truth. You've been hiding your intelligence, your instincts, your ambition. Not because they're wrong, but because someone once convinced you they'd make you unlovable. And here's the paradox. The more you hide your edge, the more you attract those who will exploit your softness. You draw in people who need you to stay guilt-ridden and uncertain, because it keeps them in control. So when that guilt rises, the guilt of saying no, of wanting more, of finally choosing clarity over comfort, don't silence it. Examine it. Ask where it came from. Ask who benefits from you staying ashamed of your power. Because here's the truth. Your guilt isn't moral. It's manipulative. Not an intention, but an origin. It was installed, it was modeled, it was taught, and now, you get to uninstall it. Power isn't the opposite of kindness. It's the context that makes kindness a choice instead of a sacrifice. You don't become dangerous when you embrace your strength. You become dangerous when you refuse to keep living beneath your full capacity. And the moment you stop feeling guilty for wanting to win, not at the expense of others, but in honor of everything you've survived, that's when they lose control. Not because you hurt them, but because they no longer know how to reach the version of you who still needed to be small to feel safe. They don't guess. They studied every emotional manipulator you've encountered. The ones who left you doubting your own memory, your own worth. They weren't improvising. They were observing. Carefully, quietly, strategically. Before they ever challenged you, they read you. Your tone, your habits, your contradictions, and most of all, your pain. Not the dramatic pain you cried over in public, the silent patterns you thought you were hiding. That's what they keyed into. Because pain, especially when unresolved, becomes routine. And routines can be mapped. Every manipulator knows. Before you touch someone's emotions, you touch their patterns. Who identify where the past still echoes in their present, where they over-explain, where they apologize first, where they flinch when misunderstood. That flinch is a doorway. You may think you're guarded, but your unresolved trauma has no poker face. It leaks into the way you say yes too fast. It shows up in the way you offer too much context, trying to preempt rejection. And it's painfully obvious in your need to be understood, a need so deep, it makes you overexpose your emotional blueprint before trust is even earned. That's the moment they strike. Not with force, with reflection. They don't seduce with power. They seduce with recognition. They mirror back your wounds in a language that feels intimate, safe, familiar. You think you've found resonance, but what you've actually found is someone fluent in your pain. This is the terrifying truth most don't want to face. Your trauma is a dossier, not because you intended to make it one, but because unhealed wounds create predictable responses. And anyone studying you long enough will start to anticipate your reactions, not by magic, but by method. You reveal what you need, and they become it. You reveal what hurt you, and they promise never to repeat it. You reveal your ideal love story, and they play the role until you're hooked. But none of it is about you. It's about control. And once they have your emotional code, they don't need to argue. They simply withdraw approval at the exact moment you need validation. They stay silent when you expect connection. They disrupt your rhythm not to punish you, but to remind you they own the tempo. Because when someone has studied your pain, they don't chase. They orchestrate. You think you're losing them. You're not. You're being repositioned. And the worst part, you feel responsible. You think, maybe if I explain myself better, maybe if I give more context, maybe if I love harder. But you're not loving. You're bargaining with someone who already decided what you're worth, and now wants to see if you'll agree. This is why silence is sacred, not as punishment, as strategy. When your pain is public, your leverage is gone. You become a map, open and legible to anyone with enough hunger and patience. But when your pain is private, when you choose discernment over disclosure, something shifts. You become unreadable, and the manipulator loses their compass. This doesn't mean isolation. It means filtration. Not everyone who wants access deserves information. Not everyone who listens deserves history. Not everyone who asks what's wrong should be answered. Because you're not obligated to reveal what cost you years to survive. Your healing is not a currency, and your past is not public record. If someone wants to know who you are, let them show who they are first. Let them earn not just your trust, but your narrative. Because when you give away the story before you see their character, you hand them a weapon disguised as intimacy. The moment you understand this, that your pain is a dossier, and your silence is a fortress, is the moment you become dangerous to every manipulator. Whoever thought they had you figured out. You don't owe anyone an explanation for what hurts. That's where real power begins. Not in loud declarations, but in the quiet decision to stop offering your wounds for public dissection. At some point, you learned that justifying your pain made it more acceptable. That if you explained it well enough, maybe people would be careful with it. But what actually happened was different. The more you explained, the more you exposed. And the more you exposed, the more people misunderstood, misused, or minimized what took you years to name. So you started over-explaining everything. Your silence, your distance, your exhaustion, even your healing. You began narrating your emotional life like a defense attorney, hoping that if people just understood, they'd finally treat you right. But they didn't. Because the ones who need you to justify your pain aren't trying to understand. They're trying to stay in control. And that's where it turns. That's where something inside you begins to shift. Because there comes a moment, sometimes after the 100th apology, or maybe after sitting in silence, while someone twists your truth, when you realize you don't have to keep explaining yourself, not because you're above it, but because the need to be understood has finally stopped outweighing the need to be intact. That's the real beginning of sovereignty. When your pain is no longer open for negotiation, you stop inviting people into your emotional process. You stop turning every boundary into a conversation. You stop translating your instincts into acceptable language. And you start protecting your clarity the same way you once protected your shame, fiercely, quietly, and with full ownership. People might say you've changed. You have. You've stopped giving them the instruction manual to dismantle you. Carl Jung understood this shift. He didn't just talk about healing, he talked about reintegration, about taking back the parts of yourself you exiled in the name of harmony. And this is one of them. The part of you that no longer justifies what it feels. You don't need to explain why you left. You don't need to explain why you said no. You don't need to explain why you're not as available, not as soft, not as easy to manipulate anymore. Because once you stop explaining your pain, it stops being a target. That silence people notice. That calm withdrawal. It's not passive aggression. It's precision. It's the kind of presence that says, I'm no longer here to make you comfortable. I'm here to remain whole. And that clarity, it can't be debated. It can't be guilted. It can't be softened into submission. When you stop offering your pain for validation, it becomes your protection. You begin to speak less, not out of fear, but out of discernment. You listen more, not to be agreeable, but to understand who's actually worthy of access. You no longer live to be understood. You live to be true. And in a world that feeds on oversharing and emotional exposure, there's nothing more powerful or more disorienting to manipulators than someone who simply refuses to explain. You don't need to raise your voice to reclaim your power. Sometimes, the most strategic thing you can do, is nothing. Not because you're weak, but because you've stopped rewarding manipulation with energy. There is a quiet presence, almost unsettling, that comes from someone who no longer reacts. And that stillness is not passivity. It's precision. It's the discipline of someone who has stopped confusing reaction with strength. Someone who understands that every impulsive response is a leak in the foundation. And manipulators love leaks. They watch for them. They test for them. They'll say something off just to see how fast you flinch. They'll go silent just to measure how long it takes for you to panic. They'll shift tone, timing, tension, not because they're emotional, but because they're calculating. The moment you react, they know where you live emotionally. But when you don't react, when you observe, pause, and choose your move with clarity, something in them short circuits, because you're no longer following their script. You're no longer dancing to the rhythm of their insecurity. You're no longer leaking your emotional state through every facial expression, tone shift, or defensive reply. And that silence, that stillness, that's when you become dangerous. Not to hurt, but to protect. You see, most people think control is about domination. But the deepest form of control is influence without noise. It's not what you say, it's what your presence demands without asking. That's the technique. Being present without being predictable. It's not about being emotionally cold. It's about becoming emotionally coded. When you walk into a room and no one can quite read your temperature, that's when you've stopped being a mirror for other people's chaos. You're no longer reflecting their projections. You're filtering them. And that's where manipulation dies. Because manipulation thrives in reaction. It feeds on your need to explain, your urge to fix, your compulsion to smooth things over before anyone gets uncomfortable. But when you don't react, you force the manipulator to confront themselves, and they hate that. You watch them pull tactics, baiting questions, delayed replies, subtle jabs. And instead of playing defense, you say nothing. You stay in the moment. You let the silence stretch. Because you know exactly what they're doing. And more importantly, you know it no longer works on you. This isn't emotional avoidance. It's emotional design. You're not shrinking. You're studying. You're choosing your words like architecture. Your pauses are intentional. Your eye contact is deliberate. You're not performing calm. You've become it. That kind of presence doesn't need to scream, explain, or convince. It just stands. And that kind of standing repels every person who once relied on your emotional availability to gain leverage. This is how you reclaim space, not by dominating the room, but by no longer being moved by it. your power becomes unspoken, not mysterious, just untouchable. The old version of you used to explain everything: your silence, your boundaries, your hesitation, your withdrawal. But the evolved version knows that what's sacred is not up for public decoding. So now, you feel the trigger, and breathe. You notice the manipulation, and stay still. You hear the lie, and don't rush to correct it. You don't play the game, because you've dismantled the need to win where there's no real value. And that's what confuses them the most. You're not cold, you're clear. You're not distant, you're exact. You're not indifferent, you're immune. This is presence as power. The version of you that no longer flinches when provoked. The version that chooses not to react. Not out of fear, but out of control. And when they realize they can no longer access your reactions, when the techniques, tones, and tactics no longer land, they stop playing. Because you've become unreadable. And what they can't read, they can't reach. There's a different kind of awareness that forms in people who've suffered quietly for too long. Not paranoia, not bitterness. Just an evolved kind of perception. The kind that no longer asks what went wrong, but sees it before it starts. When you've been used, overlooked, emotionally contorted to fit someone else's comfort, you don't come back the same. You don't react the same. You learn to notice not just what people say, but what they repeat. You track patterns, not promises. You listen less to intentions and more to consistency. It's not a wall, it's a radar. Because pain, once processed, becomes perception. And that perception rewires your emotional reflexes. You no longer jump at affection. You no longer chase closure. You don't crave to be understood by those who study your pain only to weaponize it. And that shift, that's what scares them. The people who once thrived off your need for harmony, your compulsion to explain, your desperation to be seen. They can't reach you anymore, not because you've become cruel, but because they're now speaking a language you've outgrown. The old you would have tried harder. The new you knows silence is an answer. That's what they don't expect. That someone who's bled that much could return. Not bitter, but clear. You've stopped making excuses for red flags. You've stopped mistaking intensity for intimacy. You've stopped handing out your story like it's public property. Your power isn't loud. It's unshakable. And that unshakable presence, that calm refusal to participate in emotional theater, is what creates the new dynamic. One where you're not chasing, proving, or performing. You're simply observing, choosing, owning. And the ones who used to manipulate you, they're disarmed. Because manipulation only works on the unprocessed. So now, when you enter a room, you don't bring your pain. You bring your awareness. You don't give people the benefit of the doubt. You give them time to reveal themselves. You've earned that. Discernment. Because those who've bled enough times eventually stop looking for comfort in the same hands that caused the cut. They start building something else entirely. Boundaries that don't bend. And presence that doesn't apologize. That's the real advantage, not the pain, but what you did with it. Most people don't realize how easily they hand over their power, not through grand betrayals, but through quiet, repeated self-abandonment. They explain when they should observe. They stay when silence would have said more. They offer softness where discernment is needed. And then they wonder why their life keeps repeating the same emotional script. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that doesn't rise into consciousness returns as fate." That isn't philosophy, that's warning. It means every wound you avoid, every instinct you silence, every truth you swallow, it doesn't disappear. It becomes your future. It becomes the way you choose partners, the way you tolerate disrespect, the way you rationalize pain as patience, chaos as connection. And here's the truth most aren't ready for. Healing isn't the end of pain, it's the beginning of boundaries. It's the moment when you stop needing to be understood and start being exact. It's when your silence stops being suppression and starts becoming strategy. Because once your pain is integrated, truly understood and reclaimed, no one gets to use it against you again. That's the moment you become unreadable to those who once studied your wounds. That's when your energy becomes unavailable to those who only valued your compliance. You stop arguing with manipulation. You stop reacting to emotional bait. You stop justifying your no. Not because you're above conflict, but because you no longer need to win where you've already walked away. Niccolò Machiavelli wrote, "It is better to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both. Not because fear is noble, but because love without self-respect is not love. It's currency, and manipulators spend it until it runs out." You weren't born to be predictable. You weren't made to be polite at the expense of your instinct. You weren't meant to water yourself down so that others could remain comfortable in your presence. That's not humility. That's erasure. True power, the kind that doesn't need an audience, is quiet, precise, and sovereign. It's not about control over others. It's about refusing to be controlled by your own unprocessed past. So if any part of this felt like something you've lived through, leave a comment. I want to know. And if you want to stay connected to this type of clarity, subscribe now. That's how we keep building something real without noise, without pretending, because the mirror that once reflected your pain, the one that made you question your worth, every time someone left, or lied, or tried to break you, it's not the same mirror anymore now. It's cracked, and in the cracks, they no longer see the version of you they could manipulate. They see mystery, they see force. They see someone they can no longer read. And that's where it ends. Not in war, not in revenge, but in the quiet decision to never again be a script in someone else's story.